talk a little bit about my background, because I think the reason everyone is here is you're thinking about maybe transitioning into game development, maybe figuring out what you're going to do with whatever skills you have. So my background is meandering and slightly chaotic. I'm here because I attended a Flatiron School boot camp back in 2015, and I did web development then. I have been doing web development my whole life, and I still do on a freelance basis, but coming to Flatiron School really helped me shore up my skills. I learned like vanilla JavaScript, and I think Ruby on Rails was like the main thing back then. I don't know what it is now. And then at the same time, I was also an immigration attorney doing mostly humanitarian work, which does not pay, which is why I was doing web development on the side. Because, yeah, people who are impoverished, shockingly, don't really have money to pay lawyers. So after doing web development and lawyering for some time, I found my way into the tech industry, specifically in tech recruitment, because I wanted to marry my skills in giving legal advice and in technology, and put that into like a more human-facing HR role and helping people get jobs in the fields that they want to be in. And in that role, I worked for about 7 years. And during that 7 years, I found that there was a lot of overlap between the games industry and the tech industry. And I found myself gravitating more toward game developers, like they're also looking for jobs. And so the more I interacted with them, the more I found that maybe this is my community, this is the place I want to be and be a part of. So I sort of did that on the side, did games community management, games career coaching for a time, until I finally got a paying job doing that. That was about like 5 years of grinding before I did that. And now I have found my way into the games industry, where I head up PR and community at Heart Machine, which is a smallish indie game studio based out in Los Angeles. And I run a couple different nonprofits and communities in games. That's me.
So my path into games is a little bit more direct. So I actually studied game development in college. I went to a small college called Bloomfield College in North New Jersey, and I studied video game programming. I've always known I like video games. When I was one of those 12-year-old kids that got a Nintendo 64, which also dates me quite well. That was like, this is the best. This is the media that I connect with. I absolutely want to be involved in this. And so when I was 13, I made my first video game in Java when I was supposed to be learning how to do web development, I believe, in high school or in like, late middle school. But so I went to college for it, I studied it, and I did get a job before I graduated, fortunately, and I entered making $15 an hour doing really awful client work for things I don't care about, making just like mobile games, 10, 15 years ago now, and they were bad. They weren't interesting, but they did pay anything. And they were actually funding the game development company I was working at, a small company called SortaSoft. There was 4 of us, including me, and they wanted to make their own games, but that doesn't always necessarily pay. And so I started making their client games so that they can make money, so they can make their own games. Eventually started working on those first-party titles. But my experience in the industry is much more about sidestepping within the industry and knowing how big it is. So you can see here, product lead and senior engineer, those aren't the same job at all. And I've done a very, very effective job at moving around aggressively within the industry. So I've done installation pieces for museums that are physical installations teaching children about anatomy, and I've also done arcade games, and I've also done esports first-person shooter trainers, and I've also done Web3 gaming infrastructure. That's one of the products I'm working on now. And so my experience is much more, I got in and I was like, I'm gonna write code for video games. And I was like, I actually don't really like writing code for video games that much. I much prefer to be involved in the whole pipeline of the process. I care about the product. I care about the design. I care about having high impact. And so I've navigated my way around about a half dozen smaller teams and freelance projects, kind of always working on something a bit unusual, a bit esoteric. And I think that also has given me a lot of exposure to how different people enter into the industry. Because I've worked with colleagues at a 4-person studio that have never made a game before, and I've worked at a 150-person esports gaming company where half of them actually come from like a writing technology background. Like half of them are like Google employees. And so I've seen all these different routes into the industry. And it's been really informative to the fact that right now there is no one way into the industry. And I think you'll see that's a lot of what we're going to talk about. There is no go to school and be an engineer and then be an engineer for 20 years, because even if that's what you start out as, you don't really necessarily end up there. And if you start out as a lawyer, you may end up doing community and marketing and stuff at a different company. So yeah, that's a bit about me as well.
Yeah, I just want to highlight that in both of our backgrounds, as different as they are, there is a common thread in that there was a certain amount of financial insecurity in both of our backgrounds at various points, because getting into games or like being games adjacent is rough. It is hard, it is a grind, and you might have to have one or two or a dozen side hustles.
Yeah. I mean, part of the reason I'm doing installation pieces while I'm making $15 an hour is because I need to pay rent, and I can charge a bit more for the freelance installation pieces. And if I'm doing 2 installation pieces and working a full-time job, I can eat, and that's great. But yeah, so the preface here also, yeah, it certainly is. If you want the most money, go work at IBM. If you want to potentially have a better time, in the greater macro sense, you can certainly try games. So, what does try games mean? The games industry, those first two right there is what most people think about when they think about the games industry. These are kind of a bit in order-ish, maybe, of things you might think about. Definitely programming and art are the things people think of. We'll get into the fact that programming and art are completely useless boxes with 1,000 things inside of each of them. But all of these are valid ways to step into the games industry. And I've worked, I'm sure you have as well, with somebody that's done every single one of these. The weird thing about the games industry, though, is that sometimes one person is every one of these. Like, there are one-person studios, and they're doing their own legal, they're forming their own LLC, they're doing their art, they're doing their design, they're doing their product, they're doing their marketing, they're doing any partnerships, they're doing every single bit of that. And at a company like EA, just operations might be 50 people. And that's a very, very different experience. I mean, you've kind of touched a few of those as well, right?
Yeah, I would say, like, for me personally, at Heart Machine, I wear a lot of these hats. I do a fair amount of design. I do QA, especially when we have release. I work very closely in QA. I am our HR person and hiring person because it's a small shop and I have experience in recruiting and HR. I head up all of our marketing, do all of our partnerships, and community management. So already a lot of different things, a lot of different hats. But again, it's because we are a small studio, small shop. Everyone does a lot of different things.
One thing to take away from this as well is that you won't only do one of these things unless you're working at the biggest of studios. If you're working at Ubisoft, you might get away with just doing audio, maybe. You probably still will have to touch some other aspects. But at the very least, you're going to have to talk to people from all these different departments. It isn't like traditional technology or something maybe like construction or a more physical space, where if your job is to be quality assurance on the assembly line, your job is you stand on the assembly line and you ensure that the products look good as you go off the belt. You're not talking to the engineers that are building these products. They're not even in the same building as you. But here, the engineers building the products and the artists putting art on the products and the designers creating the products and the marketing people promoting the products are sitting next to each other. And they're constantly talking to each other. And when I talk to people from marketing, as an engineer, it greatly benefits me if I'm able to speak to marketing. And it is greatly beneficial to somebody in marketing if they're able to speak to engineers, because then they can understand. And that increases the quality of the product overall. So even if you're only interested in one of these, it pays very, very well to know how to talk to all these. Because one, you don't know where you're going to end up. You might start in engineering and end up in product. That might be where you actually care to work with. And if you can speak that language and know those people and have connections in that space, it's way easier to move. Or maybe you just really like engineering or HR or IT. But when people come to you for the close-knit environment that even the biggest game studios are, like even a big company like Riot or Microsoft is going to have people talking between these different industries. And if you look at any job description in the games industry, it's going to say, cross collaboration with different studios, the ability to speak with stakeholders from different departments, blah, blah, blah. And that basically means, like, I know you're an engineer, but you got to talk to the artists, because the artists are going to hand you this file and that's the wrong format. And they're going to be like, what format do you need? And you'll be like, oh, I need an FBX. You're like, I don't know how to export as an FBX. And then, you're going to be on a call with an artist for 3 hours trying to figure out how to get the rigging working. That's just games industry. And so you have to be able to talk to them, and they need to be able to talk to you.
So just want to emphasize that it's a very multidisciplinary field and requires a lot of skills that maybe you wouldn't immediately think of when you think game development.
So there's this website. I wanted to get a list of all the different jobs in the game industry. So there's this website and much more. this is too small text for you to read. Don't worry about reading all of it. But the point here is this is a list from a company called Hitmarker. They compiled every single job in the games industry. They're wrong. There are more jobs here. Community management is not on here, for example, and that's a job.
Dare they?
I know it's not on here. I looked through. I tried to make sure.
Really?
I didn't see community. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I missed it. But I didn't see community management. I also didn't see a lot of the things related to things that are kind of in the games industry, but not just like sitting making video games, like games infrastructure companies. They're not really represented here. Emerging technologies like VR or Web3, they're not represented here. So there's a lot of things that aren't even in this, and it's already an offensively large list of items. And you can see that, game programming, I would say there's even far more items under there, right? Game programming can be broken down into like Godot engineers and Unity engineers and Unreal engineers. And you have things that, like user experience is a really nebulous blob, and there's all kinds of things. Like journalism is somewhere in here, I think, but that's a whole other part of games adjacent. And so it's really, really important to know that whatever your skills are, and we're going to kind of get to this as we move on, there is something that's translatable. If you want to sidestep into the games industry, it's in here somewhere, right? Like maybe you've only done writing. Well, great. Writing it's here, and it's here, and it's in here, and it's probably in here, and it's probably in here. And if all you've ever done is write, there's still space in the games industry for you. If you've only had done law, let's say that's all Yiyi had done, there's a whole section. There's 10 subcategories underneath there. That being said,
I did find community management. It's under marketing.
Oh, it's under. Yes. Oh, there it is. There's community management.
It's very important to me because I head up our community management team, and we are the front lines. Whenever players play our games and they want to complain, that goes through us, and it's a lot of emotional labor. So, I'm glad it was included.
I'm glad you found it. I didn't look that closely, so I'm glad you found it. So all this being said, can you go to the next slide? Here's the meme that represents this best for us. So there's a lot of things going on here, right? Like there's a lot of information. I said don't bother reading all this. I'm sure some of you were while we were talking. Right? There's a lot. And that also is kind of an intimidating aspect. It's like, well, the games industry is everything. That's useless, kind of, right? Like if the box is everything, like how do I decide kind of what I want to do and where I want to be going? So we kind of want to talk, hopefully, I think, what's your next slide? I want to make sure I'm not going out of order here. Yeah, so what you're going to find is that certain ones of those boxes are going to be drawn to you. And we're going to have some action items near the end of this about how to find those boxes and what those things are that are going to draw to you and how to identify it. But this is very much more a skills and passion-based industry. So there are plenty of industries. You can think of things like medical, right? That's the industry that is credentials only. There's some experience, there's some resumes and stuff like that, but you simply can't do surgery on people without the proper certifications to be a surgeon. You don't come in and be like, I'm really charismatic, I'd like to do surgery. And they're like, he seems like a good choice. I like him, he's a straight shooter. So, they don't, that's not how that works, right? And games isn't quite that hard, but it is much less that. I don't have a college degree. Some of my colleagues certainly do. Some people have law degrees, and some people dropped out of college to go work in games. And both of those are perfectly valid because when you're working at companies, they're going to be looking at your portfolio, your ability to do those cross communications, your interest, and really just like, do you seem like somebody that's going to help build this art? Because it is art. And so they're going to be artists collaborating with you. And because of that cross collaboration, legal and HR are going to need to sit down with engineering and product, and we have to get along. We don't have to like each other, but we have to get along. We have to be effective. And so it is a skills and passion industry. I don't know if you want to do anything.
Yeah, going back to what you were saying about making a choice, you don't really have to choose. You don't have to start out being like, I am determined to be a gameplay engineer and follow that track your entire life. There's not a direct career escalator in any way. You're free to sidestep into whatever it is that you're interested in doing. And that's the benefit of being a skills-based industry as opposed to a credentials-based industry, because you can say that I want to do game surgery without a license.
And what you're encouraged to, like if you step up into those spaces, the way that I've been able to move laterally, and I think you've had some of that same experience, is you just start volunteering for stuff. Like you step into those spaces. And so whatever your entry point is, which again, we're going to get more to those entry points, but if you start out as a QA person, so many people start out with QA and then move into support and community roles, and then move into maybe some art direction roles because they're started doing some fan art and creating content, and then they start doing background art for a game, and then 10 years later they're a lead artist at a studio. And it's because they're just kind of a bit of a bully about pushing that through, right? Like they come in and they're just kind of like, oh man, we really need to get some of these art assets done for this flyer we're working on. You're like, I'll do it. I'll do it. Let me do it. And they're like, oh, I don't know. You're like, I'll do it. I'll do it. Like, let me do it. And eventually they're like, fine, Jyro, do it. And then, you know, do a good job, like try your hardest, but they'll reward you. And then the next time that they have that same emergency, that same crunch, they're like, oh shit, we need these assets again. Jyro did a good job last time. Hey, Jyro, are you available? And then suddenly you're on call more and more and more for creating marketing assets. And then all of a sudden you're kind of in the marketing department. So yeah, it is good to be able to do those things. Going to the bullet points here. Another good thing, everybody really cares about the industry too. So if you need to care, which is great because your colleagues are going to care. You're going to show up and they're going to show up. By and large, people are in the games industry by choice. Very few people float into the games industry. It's almost like a bit like being in New York City. You have to try to be here, you know, like you don't just show up and just like, I guess I'll live here now. You know, it's not like a small town. Like you have to be in New York and commit to it. You're paying the rent, you're putting in the time, you're overcoming some of the challenges of it because you could spend half the money and live somewhere with less opportunity that you care less about. And the game industry is very similar.
But you don't necessarily have to have passion for the exact game that you are working on.
No, I don't like
because
half the games I work on.
I don't play the games that I am working on at all. That is not my genre. We're doing like a online multiplayer co-op roguelike procedurally generated thing, and I play none of those categories. So, but to be in the industry, you do have to have some amount of dedication to being there and taking up space there, because as he said, like the opportunities come to people who are loud about it and seize them. There's, for every role, there are like 10 people waiting to take your place, so you better kind of take up that space.
Which leads us to kind of the bad part about a passion industry is there is no baseline. There really aren't video game unions. There really, you know, a lot of people are willing to do work for free and do a lot of work to like kind of get in the door. We are strong advocates.
Do not work for free.
Don't work for free. Don't do it. Have some sort of pay, some sort of equity, some sort of ownership over the final product. Don't work for free. It's bad for me. You working for free hurts me. Don't work for free. No, but seriously, it is. We're moving away from that, fortunately. But the reality is that it is still a passion industry, and that means that it is really competitive. But you know, it is competitive in a way that means that where there's a shortage of doctors, maybe, there is a surplus of people that like the idea of making games. And so you do need to stand out. And you could probably, if you're an engineer, take your same skills and go work at IBM. Or, you know, if you're a marketing person, take your same skills and go work at Salesforce or whatever, and make $50,000 more your first year because they start at $90K and your first game dev job starts at $20 an hour part-time or whatever. It is the trade-off. You know, you're not going to get a 401k at your first game job most likely, or you're going to be a cog in the machine at Ubisoft working on the grass textures for a game for 6 months that doesn't get released. Which is fine, which is also fine, right? Like that's also a fine way to step into the industry, but it is the trade-off of working in a skills and passion-based industry.
Yeah, I did read an interview with someone who worked at Disney, and their first year, they just spent the entire year drawing teacups for Beauty and the Beast. So it's kind of like that. All right, this is our audience participation round.
So we'd love to get some ideas, kind of make this a little bit more tangible. Does anyone in here want to get into games? Maybe they're in an existing industry. Anyone willing to give me what you currently do, what your skills are, like what in games did you want to do? Tell me where we're at and where you want to be. Who's brave enough that you are still hands up?
Let's see. I just finished the Flatiron software engineering program actually yesterday. But kind of what led me to it was I had a background in 3D graphics, like 3D modeling and animation, and I wanted to make it interactive. And then I did a couple tutorials, and I realized I need to know JavaScript to do it, so I did the program. But yeah, I'm kind of interested in like the just like 3D interactivity, if not games, like virtual reality. 3D graphics is sort of my entry point.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of just spot on, like right in the category of you can definitely find a place in games. You coming out of a programming boot camp, I assume that you have some programming ability now, and there are roles out there. Despite the industry going into a bit of a contraction right now, there's always roles for programmers out there. It's a little tricky if you don't already have experience, and we'll get into that later, but that skill is already very valuable. Having a 3D background, have you done any like actual work and have portfolio pieces in 3D?
Mostly like hobbies. I was working in post-production, like just regular video editing, but a little. I have like a very limited 3D professional 3D animation, but it's a hobby.
Got it. And what are you using, like ZBrush, Maya, Blender?
I did a lot of Cinema 4D, Blender.
Okay, cool.
So I have a friend actually that moved from working in film and was doing a lot of motion graphics specifically. They were doing like the post-rendering motion graphics for, they were a third-party studio that would finish like the Marvel movies, you know? And so he was like a cog in a very large machine of like a team of like 50 people that at the very, very end of the pipeline of Black Panther was making the whatever characters look realistic in the 3D background. And so he got laid off from those positions and he was unsure of what to be doing. And so he actually kind of found games as another place that uses those skill sets, that uses a lot of cinematography, that uses traditional motion concepts and filmography. And so he got a job working at a studio called Volition. They're best known for like the Saints Row games. And so yeah, he worked at Volition. They did shut down recently, unfortunately. But so he worked at Volition for about like 2 years. And that was a really good opportunity for him. And so I think that there are a lot of jobs. This is probably you'd be targeting mid-sized to large-sized studios because they're going to have those dedicated roles. Like we need a 3D modeler, maybe somebody that can learn or do rigging, that knows a bit about cinematography, that can do things like cutscene production and like work on like motion effects and graphics and even trailers and things like that, which are going to need pre-rendered 3D models and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunities there. Again, sidestepping into it is like taking those skills. It's going to be a lot about, and this will be advice to anybody, it's about crafting your portfolio to highlight those skills specifically. So we'll talk a bit more about how you can find out what companies are looking for later on. But yeah, it's about like looking at that portfolio and saying, okay, I've done this for film. How do I angle it? And in an interview, say like, I can do this for games as well.
But I would also think about maybe expanding your framing, and that's kind of what we were talking about in this talk, to not necessarily silo yourself to, like, these are the hard skills I have, and this is the direction I must go into. If you've done post-production work, then maybe you could be a producer. If you have done anything that is external facing, maybe you can get into marketing. So those are all still relevant skills, even if you wouldn't immediately associate your background with those titles.
Pro tip for anybody as well, have multiple resumes. I have 3 different resumes. I have an engineering resume, a product resume, and a management resume. And so I send those out differently. And when I feel compelled to send out a batch of resumes for product, I will shift my LinkedIn around to show all my product experience. Then like, oh, this month I'm focusing on engineering roles. So all of a sudden I'm the lead engineer again instead of the product lead. So yeah, you can do the same as well. Anyone can. Anyone else want to volunteer where they're at? Yeah, so coming from a more UX background and moving into more like user research and perhaps like game development and those kind of tools, you said writing a bit as well. Game companies desperately need data in any sort of form. And so, I mean, UX and user experience are very important, and a lot of that is data-driven in the games industry. It's a very iterative industry. And so the skills that are mostly transferable there is anything that you can say, like, I'm very good at working with this data and building upon it. I can read in data, I can see where people are at, I can build user experiences and then suggest different types of idea, writing those up, making them nice and concise. We do that a tremendous amount because before, from the idea of a game to when it's released, it's going to change dramatically throughout the life cycle. And all of that is based on user experience and feedback. And so, even outside of QA and like testing specifically, just the idea of like, how do we test to see, is this procedural generation system we're working on more fun than this other idea? What is the user experience of these? How do we guide people through these things? Like tutorials all need UX and a way to guide players through. So, and also need writing, right? Like it is an elegant thing to be able to guide players through a game, through an experience. Your favorite game, you don't remember what the tutorial is because it was so good and so ingrained that you didn't think about it. And there are plenty of games where it pops up and there's 10 pages of text. You're like, I'm not reading this, right? And people need to solve those problems.
Yeah, and then again, thinking outside the box a little bit, you don't have to squarely be in UI, UX, research, QA. You can also think about games need to make money, and in order to make money, they have to have good business. And business analytics is a massive part of fundraising for games, for publishers trying to pursue venture capital, all of those things. So being able to contribute to that because you have a good grasp of what the market or the user wants is perhaps an avenue you could explore. I think you guys are constantly thinking about metrics and trying to present them in order to pursue funding and demonstrate product market fit and just general proof of concept. So getting in early with a game studio could also be very helpful.
Yeah, either big studios that have a whole department that's going to be focused on kind of those interests, or again, small studios that are growing. Especially, I would say, in emerging technologies, there's a lot of proof of concept in things like VR and Web3 and AI spaces. They're contentious, of course, but they are industries that pay, and they are industries that have a much more data-hungry thing because they're taking the more venture capital approach. They're trying to prove out these concepts and come up with data-heavy solutions. Whereas, a 3-person indie studio making a platformer because they really like Mario, probably not as much, right? But yeah, so there's opportunities, I think, on the really big and then on the small but experimental spaces. That's who's really using user experience and metrics, and also needs people that can explain that, because they need to sit down with the VC and say, this is our numbers, this is the information, this is what we're doing with users, this is how we're guiding them through, this is our retention rates, this is why it's important. So VCs can go, that makes sense, I should give you $1 million, which is, Nope. You don't need to take courses in anything, really. I would say that if you're not as much on the analytics side, then focusing more on, again, that user experience and retention side is really important. I would say, as a general statement, you don't need to take courses in anything for anything in game development. You can watch a lot of YouTube videos if you're curious about the things that you fill in. I certainly think that my formal education did less for me than my first 2 months of just self-learning experimentation, on the job at a $15 an hour, sort of thing. So yeah, you don't need to take courses. If you're curious about taking courses, if you're somebody that really gets rewarded by schooling, if that's how you connect with data, then yeah, you can certainly take it. But I would say just watching some intro level YouTube videos so that you feel confident enough to put as your skills you're familiar with, data analytics on your resume, and just can kind of back that up a little bit. There's a good chance the person interviewing you, especially a small company, is going to know less than you already about that, and will be happy to have your expertise on board.
Yeah, skills-based industry. It is a challenge to be able to demonstrate your skill, and sometimes having a credential or certificate is a shortcut to being I know how to do this, but you don't necessarily need those if you have a portfolio or have made a YouTube tutorial yourself and be hey, I've already done this, I can speak cogently about this topic. That's really all you need. You can do it on your own and mostly for free.
All right, so we'll have more Q&A at the end where we can definitely go over more of these. I saw some more hands. We can do more of this for sure. We do have a few more slides. So we talked a lot about studio sizes here. They're very, very different. This, and that basically might as well be completely different industries in some way, shapes, and forms. Even this, we usually break this down into 2 separate categories, indie and solo, when we talk about this. Do you want to go through these?
I couldn't squeeze in 5, so I just smashed them together. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different studio sizes, and each of them have various things that they care about as far as their workforce. The larger you get, the more they want sort of a T-shaped resume or background, if you guys are familiar with that. They want a wide breadth of experience and then go deep on one thing, because they are going to silo you into a department drawing teacups or making grass. And then the smaller you get, the more multidisciplinary, varied skills are valued, because they don't have as much money and they want you to be able to do a lot for less money, essentially. So they want more bang for their buck from you, the smaller you get. We have a friend who is a solo dev. His name is Jonah. He runs Whale Food Games, and he puts on his LinkedIn that he is the CEO, secretary, programmer, and janitor at Whale Food Games, because he does all of the things.
Again, going between these is the smaller you get, the bigger the opportunity is in some ways, in that you get to move more laterally, right? If that's something you care about, you're like, one, you don't have, if you start at AAA, if you start at Ubisoft, you're probably gonna get a 401k, you'll probably get paid like slightly more, but you'll have to be like on site in Irvine, California from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. working on grass. At an indie solo games, it's gonna be Jonah from Whale Food Games, and he's looking for somebody to partner with that knows like marketing and art, because he knows like programming and analytics. And so he's like, help, like let's be teammates essentially. And he probably can't pay you a lot up front, or he might be able to pay you a lot more in equity, right? And so he's gonna be like, hey, I'll give you half of whatever our game sells, and I can pay you like $15 an hour up front. And you're like, well, I'm very motivated to work to sell this game then, because I'm making half of all the revenue, even if I'm only making $15 an hour. And then also, you've done many, many things. By the end of this, you have experience with marketing, you have experience with art direction, you have experience with asset creation, you have experience with releasing a game, you have experience with creating assets to put a game on Steam, and you're building that top of that T if you want to work in those bigger studios. That being said, if you work at Ubisoft, you get to put, I worked at Ubisoft on my resume. And that carries weight, right? There is value to having that. And the next job you get, if you're trying to apply to maybe one of these two, you're like, well, I worked at Ubisoft, so I command a premium. And they're like, we'll do it, we'll pay you. And you don't tell them how much you made at Ubisoft. You made like 60K at Ubisoft, but when you apply to Respawn, you're like, I would like 120, please. And they're like, oh, what a deal, he works at Ubisoft. So, but it is a trade-off, right? Like here, you're gonna be working from home, you're gonna be working on your own hours, you're gonna be working closely with like 1 to 30 other people, you're gonna have a lot of say in what gets created. Your vision, your work is gonna be represented in the final product. You're gonna be super high impact, and you're gonna be super flexible, and you're gonna be able to say like, I made this fucking game, like this is mine, I care about it. And over here, you worked on that car, just that car. That's all you worked on, the entire project. And then they cut that car from the game. It's in a DLC that won't get released. That's the reality of working at Activision Blizzard. You work on Hearthstone for 30 years, and they're like, actually, we've decided to cut the card you made for balancing reasons. And you're like, okay, I have no say in this. Like, that's not my call, and that's just where I live now. And then somebody's like, oh, what'd you do at Hearthstone? And you're like, nothing that I can show you, like nothing that exists, because what I did work on is still under NDA because it's unreleased content. So you get the idea. And then, of course, in between, you have sort of that middle round, right? Like working at Supergiant, it makes like Hades, for example, pretty reasonably high impact. They're a team that has a lot of communication and collaboration. But if you're in marketing, you're still in marketing, right? You're not writing any code. So,
a small segue into NDAs. Do sign NDAs if you need to, but try to negotiate with the company that you need to be able to show that in future portfolio pieces to demonstrate that you did not waste 3 years building a car that didn't get shown. And I mean, you mentioned cuts, so that I think a good segue into our next slide.
I made this chart. I thought it was very funny. This is currently the state. It's about 64% yikes right now. And maybe not some yikes, still maybe yikes. So you've probably all seen, anybody that's following the games industry at all, there's a lot of layoffs going on at every level of it. Small studios aren't having layoffs because they're just closing. You don't hear about the small studio layoffs because they just don't exist. When Whale Food Games stops existing, it won't make the news. But when Sony lays off 900 people from their PlayStation division, it's like they had 900 extra people in the PlayStation division? Like, holy shit, how big is this company? But that is the current state. So kind of going through these in order, funding is hard right now. If you're a small studio getting a publisher on board, they're all very afraid to take risks right now. Everybody in the industry is very skittish. There's interest in spending, but there's a lot of reluctance because a lot of the games that have been coming out recently haven't been paying off as much as people would like, because a lot of these companies, they were previously, Cyberpunk was a $500 million game. And in order for them to make their money back, they need to sell $500 million worth of games. And that's break even. That's making no money for the studio. So their game needs to be like $1.5 to $2 billion of sales before they're like, woo, we 3x'd, So they're very, very reluctant to invest in big games. And they're very, very reluctant to invest in small games because they've been burned on just like the deliverability of these kind of games from big to small, that they're like, well, you don't have a track record, like you haven't really worked on titles before, so I don't know. So it is very hard. currently funding? I mean, I know you.
Yeah, it's difficult also to like get any fresh IP out there because again, publishers or investors are risk averse and they do not want to invest in like this gremlin you've created that is your life's work that nobody's ever heard of and they don't know if they can sell the merch around.
Yeah, you know what's getting invested in right now? Monopoly Go.
Yeah.
Monopoly Go, they're just fucking
Yeah, just
pouring
shit
money
like that.
into Monopoly
Yeah.
Go.
For better or worse, like there's garbage out there. But that all said, the middle zone I think is still the most hopeful or comfortable zone as far as games funding because, like, let's say you are EA and you have $100 million to invest in games. Right now, they are more likely to invest in $10 million games and hope one of them is a hitter than a single $100 million game. And so if you are trying to seek stability in games, whatever little there might be, I would target kind of mid-sized studios rather than like a massive studio or like do a tiny indie project that might never get seen.
Yeah, right now, you know, we had that thing up here before, and so the indie solo side, very hard to get funding. That's where you work if you want to do something for you, if you care about something. All the way on the other side, that's where you work if you just want a name on your portfolio. And where funding is going is in those two middle slots. And a lot of times they're funding each other, which is pretty interesting. So the really, really big studios are reluctant to fund. The really small studios have no fucking money. And the middle-sized studios, they're actually, you know, the 1,000-person studios are funding the 100-person studios right now because they want more games. They're often like Devolver or, you know, these like Avalanche. They're acting a bit as publishers as well, and so they want more products and more IP in their content. And so they don't want to take a chance on this, and they can't afford Ubisoft. So what they do is they find these 50, 100, 200-person studios, and they're like, we'll give you a $5 million check, which funds you for development of product. And so that's where the money is floating around right now. I was also where I think we're both most mindful of job opportunities. Like, you know, of course, Facebook's always hiring, but they just, you know, are permanently hiring for their games division, kind of. And small studios aren't hiring. But yeah, it's the heart machines right now that need an Unreal engineer, and they do, so.
And we're very thoughtful about like who we hire and ability to retain them and not just hire someone and lay them off 3 months later. So
Very focused on sustainability.
yeah, sustainability. And yeah, another example is Inner Sloth. They made Among Us. They are like 12 people or something.
They've been hiring. They're like 20 or 30 now.
But they are like, they made a shit ton of money from a very shitty game. And they are now using that to fund other games. They have started a fund called Outer Sloth. And they're like looking for smaller projects to take on because they care about it. They are able to. And probably because they want something like maybe a little more attractive than Among Us in their portfolio.
So yeah, we'll talk more about hiring senior roles. The one-line intro there is right now, most of those jobs, though, are going to people with experience. And so we're going to talk at our last slide about kind of how to get that experience. Ending on a positive note, though, the games industry is bigger than it's ever been. It's growing. It is the biggest, most profitable form of media that has ever existed. It outpaces every other form of art. It outpaces movie. It outpaces TV. It outpaces traditional print media. Every single one of those is just obliterated by games right now. It passed the movie industry, you know, like within the last 10 years, and it's just continued to skyrocket. So even with the layoffs, even with some amount of contraction, games are an absolute permanent part of the creative world, and more the tooling and the accessibility and the interactivity that games are providing is showing up in other media. The Mandalorian uses Unreal Engine for its background sets. Like, more and more games are just a permanent part of all media. And if you don't have a mobile app for your TV show somehow, like, what are you doing as a big studio, right? Like, everything has to have a game. So, this is a problem.
And it's not just unique to games. It's also like in software engineering as well, I think. Yeah. You need experience to get experience, and then how do you get experience without experience? How do you get into the roles without having experience that require you to have experience? It's nuts.
So we spoiled the answers here a little bit, of course. Is it possible to get experience without having experience? Of course it is. It's not always fun, and it's not always going to be what you want to be doing, and it's not always going to pay because you're going to be working. Don't work for other people for free. Working for yourself for free is fine. Pay you and your time and your sweat equity. But yeah, you can get experience, and you have to. You have to get experience. It's kind of what we went back to, you know, talking a bit, that sort of audience participation section. It's like, taking what you have and giving the illusion of experience, both through actually doing stuff, as well as through targeting what you've already done in other industries, in other parts of your life, hobby projects, games that you've made with friends, and targeting those to be as attractive as possible. Suddenly you go from, yeah, I worked on a game with my friends, it was whatever, to, I actually was the lead engineer on a 3D first-person shooter experimental prototype built in Unreal using blueprints. And people are like, ooh, we're hiring a blueprint engineer. And so just angling that and then using these things, I mean, you're a bit more in this space.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned before that people usually don't just float into the games industry, but I did kind of just wander into the games industry because for 5-6 years I was doing community management and community building for free for myself, mainly because I was making a game and I wanted to have playtesters ready to play my game. I ended up killing that baby, but keeping the community around it. So networking is incredibly important. It's great that you guys are here, IRL, meet space. That's the best way to connect with people, honestly. In any industry where there is a bit of a contraction or a recession, the roles that are out there do tend to go to people who are referred in by other employees. So being out there and talking to people and having them build empathy for your situation and understand your skill set and how it fits into their team is incredibly important. And in the meantime, you can freelance for, some extra rent money.
Yeah, and these are actually all really focused around, at a very, very basic level, two things: networking and building a portfolio. Those are the two things that you should be solely focused on if you want to get to the games industry. Certifications, kind of useless. No one's going to care about them. Like, if you want to go to school and get a degree, great. That is sort of like a good way to build connections and to build a portfolio. When you graduate, nobody's going to go, what was your GPA? They're going to go, what did you do? What did you do in your games project? What's your capstone project? What did you work on with your friends? What are you working on right now? And so if you can answer those questions by doing things like game jams, by doing personal projects, ideally with colleagues or friends if possible, and by doing some sort of freelancing, if you can get it, whatever it looks like, you're going to be building both of those things up. So at a game jam, you can go to game jams, do them if you're interested in them at all, go in and talk to those people, build a team, make new friends. I would recommend going to game jams and building teams with people you haven't worked with before, because people like us and our colleagues in the game industry still do game jams. We host game jams, we run game jams. And, we may end up chatting with one of you guys and you're like, oh, I actually do, 3D work and vector stuff. I'm like, oh, I could actually use some 3D work for my game. Like, do you do hourly work? Like, I'd love to pay you for just a week or two of work to get some models made. And you're like, yeah, that sounds great. And now all of a sudden you have a work credit on my game and my game is getting published by Devolver. And you're like, I worked on a game that was being published by Devolver. And that's something that we are constantly doing ourselves. It's just kind of pushing ourselves into those spaces. I had a meeting yesterday with a magazine. They're like a news publication called The Defiant. They cover games and emerging tech, and they're based in New York. And so I went to their office. I'd met them at a convention, just made friends with them at a convention. I was like, oh, we're so close to each other. I'm like a 10-minute walk from your office. Literally went there yesterday and was chatting with them, telling them a bit about my work and stuff like that. But I was like, if you guys need a guest article anytime, I'd love to write something for you. Like, oh yeah, that'd be really interesting. We actually should get more into games. I know a bunch of people in games. I'd love to connect you guys. And all of a sudden to them, I'm a games industry expert and writing guest articles. And then what goes on my resume? That I write articles for The Defiant. And it's just about being pushy a little bit, honestly.
Yeah, you really have to shove yourself in there. He's, I think, on a couple of the credits for the games that I've worked on because he just offered to playtest.
I'll playtest.
Yeah. And then those games are listed on whatever the IMDb for games is, and all of a sudden you have 4 extra credits and you barely had to, you spent an hour playing the games.
Yeah, I did a one playthrough front to back of a 90% finished version of Solar Ash, one of the games that they worked on. I literally just played the game. I liked it. I had fun, and I just did a live stream of it, kind of with the things, and 2 separate 4-hour play sessions. I was just hanging out.
Credit.
Bam, credit. Literally in the credits of the game and on game websites where they're like, Jyro Blade has a credit as quality assurance and this. I don't do quality assurance, but now I do.
Yeah, we are ending kind of on action items. You can feel free to take out your phones and do these things, or maybe do it a little bit later.
But you can do these now,
you can do these literally
before
right
you
now.
go home today. You
Yes.
can do these things. Do this. Please do this. If you do any of these, one of these things, this is the one that I always recommend. If you're not sure where to get started, we talked about how do you get started, how do you find out what skills you need. Go to your favorite game studio. big one, mid-sized one. It's probably harder on a small one because it might not have a careers page, but just like pick a studio you've heard of that you would be interested in working for, whether it's Riot or whether it's, you know, Heart Machine, and just go to their careers page because there's going to be a few job openings. See what they're hiring for.
And maybe ignore the job titles and just look in the descriptions and say like, oh, I don't have this title in my experience or history, but I do check like 8 of these boxes. So then just go for it.
Yeah, or I'd want to do that. Like you know, I don't know if I would be a marketing manager. I'm not sure what that is. Let me look into it. Oh wow, actually I do have experience in a few of these things, and like I actually definitely could see myself doing more of these sort of items. So do that, please. Like if you're not sure about the games industry, this will also give you a much better idea of what we're currently hiring for in the games industry and what sort of skills and how to translate it. You can look and say like, I think I've kind of done this, but my resume currently doesn't exactly explain that. And you can just take those words from their job posting and put it right into one of your descriptions. I definitely do that all the time.
Yeah. And then that sort of segues into the things you can do later today. And going off of looking at the games career pages of game studios, I usually suggest that people find a person with the exact role that they want and study them, look at their background, try to figure out like, okay, this is how they present themselves in the market, and they are now in a role that I want to be in. So maybe I can try to reformat or rephrase items on my resume or LinkedIn to look more like that person. Because if I look like them, then maybe I can be them.
Yeah, and again, a lot of these you'll see, a lot of these are just about making those connections, building that portfolio initially out. Like, you know, so we have go to YouTube. We don't have 10 classes. 10 classes are valuable to you, but this is going to help you a lot more. Talks like this, I think, are going to give you a better grounded reality. I watch YouTube videos more than I do anything else for learning. And do this. This is fun. Play a game you like, and then think about it as a designer. Think, why did they make this design choice? Why is this level layout like this? Why did they use this color scheme? I wonder how they're doing the physics for this. Start thinking about it because it'll start informing what you give a shit about. If you're like, ooh, how'd they do this physics system? I don't fucking care about this. You're probably not gonna be working on a physics engine, right? But if you're like, ooh, how did they choose these colors? This is such an interesting contrast of like these like vibrant with like these dark backgrounds. Maybe you should start looking at art direction roles. Start looking at like, you know, roles that are doing environmental design because that's what you care about.
Yeah. They'll be warned. The more you do it, I mean, it is a muscle that you train. You might get
ruin
really
it.
good at it. But the more you do it, the more it might ruin certain games for you because you think too much about the craft that went into it and not so much just about playing the game and immersing yourself in it.
Yeah, I can't play a game without being like, this double jump feels a little sticky. I don't know. Like they should have used a different sort of mechanic for this.
Yeah.
Cool. I think
that's it.
that's it.
Yeah.
That's us. If you want to connect with us, this is how to find us. We're pretty easy to find. Our names are also pretty good SEO. So
Yours is way better than mine.
mine's really good for SEO. Yeah. So we do have a few minutes for questions for anyone that we didn't get to. I looked at you before you had your hand up before, so go ahead.
So I'm in data science, but trying to mentor people who are interested in applying data science, the machine learning, AI, all the things that are like extra outside of just like the regular recommendation systems from Steam to recommend you, games and trying to do the marketing, or like one of my colleagues works at Epic Games and does like the models to see who's cheating the games, like ban them, right? So outside of those kind of like data science and AI use cases, what are some other use cases that I can think of?
So what are some use cases for data science sort of aspects? Or AI. Wow. So AI is, I mean, growing and growing. And a lot of the games jobs that we're starting to see now are dealing with AI. And it's not necessarily generative AI, but it is traditional machine learning AI. And so I would say that actually like there's a huge undefined box right now to the point where a lot of companies know they want to leverage these tools. And they're looking at machine learning and you know, some amount of Gen AI, but much more just like, you know, behavioral AI and saying like, well, how do we leverage this to do better monetization systems? How do we do this for better user retention? And so that box is pretty big, I would say, and is going to only continue growing, especially as the industry starts to get over the initial like sticker shock of like generative AI having a bad name, and realizing that we've been using AI in games for about 70 years now, and so like we're probably going to keep using AI in games. So yeah, I would say that my advice would be that if you want to give them guidance, it would be, again, to go to, you know, do that first step of going to the game industry pages and see what sort of AI tooling they might already be using. Additionally, a lot of game companies right now aren't doing that in-house. So there are a lot of AI and analytics firms and AI and data, like analysis firms. Things like PlayFab, for example, is a great option. So PlayFab does a lot of like networked multiplayer and anti-cheat and data tracking and creates beautiful graphs of pipeline funnels of every step along your game. And they're using AI very, very heavily. And so game companies will use PlayFab for a lot of those systems because they don't want to build that all themselves. And so I would say, look at what companies are game companies hiring to solve those problems, because that's where most of those jobs currently are.
No, that was a good answer. Good job.
So the biggest piece of advice I got from this was don't work for free, which I agree. I like that. Thank you for that. One of my questions is, when it comes to playtesting, does that not also count as working for free? And also, how does one get more into playtesting as they start off with getting into their game career?
Yeah, the question being, how does playtesting not count as working for free? And also, kind of how do you get into playtesting and move along that pipeline? Work for pizza sometimes. That's okay. Working for pizza is fine.
Working for pizza, working for credit. I just led a friends and family playtesting round, and everyone who playtests our game will be in the credits for Hyperlight Breaker. So that's something. That'll give you something. We did not pay our playtesters, unfortunately. We just don't have budget for something like that. But and it's also, honestly, like, if you're paying playtesters that are not as likely to give you unbiased reviews because they feel like they are obligated to say certain nice things. But yeah, work for pizza, work for a stake in the game, and work for exposure in just in that one little bit.
You can also work for debt equity, essentially. So we test each other's games constantly. And that means that when I test Solar Ash, that means she's got to test the systems that I'm building for Battlefly. And we have at GUMBO, which is, we haven't talked about it at all really, but GUMBO is the largest game development nonprofit. It's a collective based in Brooklyn. And so GUMBO, definitely check us out. We run a lot of events and meetups and playtest nights. And we have playtest nights, and GUMBO itself provides just some simple food for it. But the way that you do it is you bring your game that you want to have people play test. We do both tabletop and digital, and you show up and you'll have a few rounds of people playing your game, and then you're obligated to play their game as well. And so you get to trade those feedbacks. So you're not working for free, you're working for them also doing some work for you in the future. And you can do the same sort of thing. So when I'm play testing for Solar Ash, yes, I didn't get paid, but I know that the whole team from Heart Machine now has a relationship with me, and I can kind of ask stuff from them. It's not like big stuff, but I can ask Yiyi to review something that I'm working
I'll
on.
do it, but most of the team is mad at you. He gives very ferocious feedback.
I'm pretty critical. But still, just connections, I've asked, hey, we need a Unity engineer, an Unreal engineer to build a small tool that we're building. And I asked Yiyi to ask her team if anybody would be interested. And so Yiyi and her team, owe me at least the courtesy of hey, Jyro, who did some feedback for us, is looking for this resource. And so, yes, but working for free doesn't always mean working for pay, but it does mean working for some sort of resource that you can leverage. Ideally, it's not just strictly exposure, right? But if it is truly an in, and if it's a low amount of work, like playtesting, and the way you get into that is by attending GUMBO type events, is by looking up these playtest events that happen in New York City. It's even places like the Uncommons, these board game cafes. They'll have nights where game designers will be hey, we're going to be releasing a new game. We're having a playtest night, and anybody that's interested, just follow the spaces that do games in New York City. And when they say we're doing an experimental game for Love Island, or what's George's game called?
Lovestruck.
Lovestruck. So we had a
Love
friend.
Island, the game. It's great.
Yeah, and so it's a board game, and so our friend was making that, and he just found local game cafes Sip and Play and Uncommons and D20 Store, whatever the place is called, and they would run playtest nights, and the people that came up there are now affiliated kind of with George, and they're also people that want to make games, and they're hey, we want to playtest my game, and he's yeah, come to GUMBO, and you get the idea. So.
But don't go to the Uncommons because they're having a union issue.
Oh, is that true?
Sip and Play is great though.
Yeah. How age-friendly is entering the game industry? Very.
Yeah, I have a daughter. She's 6. She is already making games, and she will probably be making games her whole life, hopefully, if I have anything to do with it.
And on the upper end. Yeah.
Oh, on the other end. Sorry, the other. Yeah.
Very much.
Very
Super.
much. Yeah.
I was the person I referenced before that got a job at Volition. He's in his late 40s, and that was his first time getting into games, and just from working in film or whatever. Cool thing about games is that it is, because it's a skills-based industry, it is, and not credential-based, it doesn't mean that like your stuff gets like out of date in the same way, and people aren't like, it's not like there's like, oh, all the young group of doctors or like, you know, tech, where it's like, oh, well, you didn't study at this particular boot camp that only existed for the last 2 years, then we don't want to hire you. It's like, hey, I've been working in illustration for comic books for like 50 years, and I'd love to do some illustration for games, and you find a company that's doing a game that wants that art style, and they're like, we would love to have the experience of somebody who's been in that industry. So again, it's about angling your skills. But I would say age-wise, I see extremely little, if any, age discrimination in the games industry. Of all the problems we have, it's not with age. Yeah.
It's not as much like the tech industry where there's kind of like the bro-y culture, and you got to be able to like play beer pong and eat pizza with these people, or you can't get hired. Yeah, it's very different. Yeah. We both do a tremendous amount of community stuff. Oh, sorry. Can I talk a little bit more, or can we talk a little bit more about community management and what it involves? Yeah, we both do a fair amount of community management in our day jobs. I think we're both like tend to be more public facing in our roles, and part of being public facing is engaging with players and customers. And for me, community management is a lot of different things. I see myself in a service role to the community and to the games projects that I'm on. I am there to support whatever helps them enjoy our projects the most. So if they want to make fan art, I will create contests for them to like all get together and make fan art. If they want to build mods, I will talk to engineering and try to find like ways to integrate whatever it is that they are looking for, expose whatever back-end things that they're looking for. If they are, I don't know, if they're having like job issues, I create opportunities for people on our team to like do portfolio reviews or resume reviews and talk to the people. So it's really, for me, it's about like helping my community, and in doing so, creating sort of a relationship or a bond with them that makes them more loyal to the things that I'm trying to promote, so that eventually when our games do come out, they become our product evangelists. They are out there to say like, oh my God, Yiyi was so amazing to us the past year. She was like hanging out with us in Discord, we're watching anime together, and now their game is out. Like, let's go talk to all of our friends and have them all buy this game, and so we can all play it online together.
I would say that you're also in a weird position where the games industry is a space that the end product has a very deep dialogue with the audience. When you play a game, it's a very personal experience, and when you know, many people have a really deep personal connection with the media they've grown up, especially if it's games. I mean, and that is certainly true of people that played Hyper Light Break or Hyper Light Drifter, their first game, and it's definitely true of a lot of our community as well, because I often do, like I said, even in Web3, like, it's a financial investment. So there's everything, all kinds of weird spaces where people have a very personal connection, whether it's monetary or emotional or nostalgic or community-based. And games are weird in that, like, despite that deep dialogue, they're actually very not dialogue on the development process often, where that's why people who play games often have such a disconnect with what game companies are doing. And you can see people being very upset, like, oh, I can't believe they changed the art on this character. Like, I hate this. And people have very, very big reactions to very small things because they've anchored to that. To them, that's how Link looks. And drawing him like they did in Wind Waker was offensive. Like, how dare they draw Link this way? This is not who I think Link is. And it feels hard for them to not have a discussion with Nintendo, because Nintendo's like, well, we're going to do it this way. And especially on that, you know, the right half of that, the indie and smaller studios, I think we have a deep responsibility to be a dialogue position as the development process is going on. And that works in both directions, where they feel like they have agency. So yes, I might not, if they're like, I hate your art direction, the end result may be, I don't care if you hate it, we're gonna do it anyway. But that's not how they feel, because, hey, I hear you. I understand where you're coming from. Here's where we're coming from. This is why we're making that change. This is why it's important to us. We really hope you're along with us for that ride. And they're like, okay, because now they see you and an organization as people, as somebody that cares about them, that has heard their input. And so I think that that's a really deep, important part of community building and management, is creating that dialogue where they feel like they have a voice. And then you can also empower that. As you mentioned, they become your evangelists because they feel like these guys are looking out for me. They care about the things that I care about. And I want to make sure that everybody knows how great this organization is, how cool these games are, and how excited I am. So then they're out there. You turn people that are like, what the fuck are you doing? I hate this. This is unbelievable. Into, Now, you know what? These guys are great. Like, I really like them. I like what they're doing, and I want to make sure that everybody knows. And then they'll defend you. You know, like people will be like, oh, I hate this art direction. Like, no, you don't understand. Like, this is the best. Like, here's the reasons why. And so, yeah, so you end up with, you know, a whole team of community, and you need to build that, especially in today's game design world where that high castle approach of like, well, we know what's best for the games works for like maybe Nintendo, but it doesn't work for these small to mid-sized studios. So, yeah.
I think that's it.
Yeah, we're out of time. Cool. Thanks, everyone.